The blood-red sun was setting over the rugged cliffs of Blackthorn Canyon when Nora Bennett realized she had made a terrible mistake. Her canteen was empty, her horse was gone, and the narrow path she had been following had disappeared beneath a recent rockslide. It was 1875 in the unforgiving Arizona Territory, and Nora had just become another fool who had underestimated the deadly beauty of the western frontier. Nora wiped the sweat from her brow and adjusted her torn dress, once a fashionable blue calico that had been her pride on the journey west from Boston. 3 months ago, she had been the respectable daughter of a banker, traveling to start a new life as a schoolteacher in Durango, Colorado. Now she was just another desperate soul about to be swallowed by the vastness of the canyon lands. "Think, Nora," she whispered to herself, scanning the steep walls rising around her. The stage had been ambushed 2 days ago by bandits who had taken everything of value and scattered the passengers. She had fled on foot, somehow finding herself in this massive canyon system that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Her stomach cramped with hunger, and her lips were cracked from thirst. She had found a small stream earlier that day, but in her eagerness to follow it to civilization, she had instead wandered deeper into the labyrinth of stone. The last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the canyon rim, plunging her world into shadow. Nora shivered, wrapping her arms around herself as the desert night quickly cooled the air. She found a small alcove in the rock wall and huddled inside, trying to make herself as small as possible. Just until morning, she promised herself, closing her eyes against the tears that threatened. Things will look better in the light. 50 miles away, Yates Sanderson pushed his hat back and surveyed the scattered cattle he'd been driving toward the higher pastures. At 32, he was one of the most respected ranchers in the Durango area, having built the Diamond S Ranch from nothing more than a small plot of land and a handful of scrappy cattle he'd purchased 7 years ago after returning from the war. "Boss, you see that dust cloud to the south?" His foreman, Hank Miller, asked, pointing toward a thin plume rising in the distance. Yates narrowed his steel-gray eyes. "Could be riders or a stage. This far out ain't no stage route through here." Hank scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Might be trouble." Yates nodded grimly. "Take the men and the herd back to the North Ridge. I'll ride out and see what's what." The war had taught Yates caution, but also the value of facing potential threats head-on. He mounted his stallion, a powerful black gelding named Midnight, and rode toward the dust cloud, his Winchester rifle secure in its saddle scabbard. As he approached, he saw not riders but a single stagecoach moving erratically across the rough terrain. The driver was slumped over, and the horses were running at will. Yates spurred Midnight forward, catching up to the runaway stage and grabbing the reins of the lead horses. After bringing the stage to a halt, he discovered the driver had been shot through the shoulder and was barely conscious. "Bandits," the man gasped. "Hit us. At Devil's Pass, took everything, passengers scattered." "How many passengers?" Yates asked, helping the man down. "5, including a schoolmarm headed for Durango." The driver winced as Yates examined his wound. "Young lady from back east." "First time in these parts." Yates frowned. "A city woman alone in this territory wouldn't last long." "Where exactly were you attacked?" The driver pointed weakly toward the east, near the entrance to Blackthorn Canyon. Yates felt his blood run cold. Blackthorn was a maze of narrow passages and high walls, easy to get lost in and nearly impossible to find someone who didn't want to be found or someone who couldn't find their way out. If the bandits had chased her in there, or if she'd fled in that direction. "I need to get you to town," Yates said, helping the man onto Midnight. "Then I'm going back for the others." By nightfall, Yates had delivered the driver to the doctor in the small settlement of Copper Springs and gathered a small search party. The local sheriff, an old friend named Frank Thompson, had organized 3 other men to join them. "If they've been scattered for nearly 2 days already, the chances ain't good," Frank said quietly as they prepared their supplies. "Especially for that Eastern lady." Yates tightened the cinch on his saddle. "I'm not leaving anyone out there to die, Frank, not if there's a chance." The sheriff nodded, knowing better than to argue. Yates Sanderson was known for his stubborn determination, a trait that had served him well in building his ranch, but sometimes drove his friends to distraction. As dawn broke the next morning, they split up to cover more ground. Yates took the most dangerous route, heading directly into Blackthorn Canyon. Something told him that's where he needed to search, perhaps, because it was where he would be least likely to go if he had a choice in the matter. The canyon was eerily silent as he rode midnight carefully along the narrow path that wound between towering walls of red and orange stone. The only sounds were the horses' hooves on the rocky ground and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. "Hello." Yates called out periodically, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Anyone hear me?" By midday, he had found nothing, and the canyon was growing narrower, forcing him to dismount and lead Midnight by the reins. The heat was oppressive, reflecting off the stone and creating a furnace-like atmosphere. It was late afternoon when he spotted something blue caught on a thorny bush near a dried stream bed. Approaching cautiously, he recognized it as a piece of fabric, a woman's fabric, too fine for these parts. Yates tied Midnight to a scraggly juniper and followed the stream bed, which curved around a massive boulder. That's when he saw her. She was curled on her side beneath a shallow overhang, her dress torn and dirty, her dark hair tangled around her face. For a terrible moment he thought he was too late. "Miss," he called softly, approaching carefully. Nora's eyes flew open at the sound of a human voice, and she scrambled backward, pressing herself against the rock wall. A tall man stood before her, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, a gun belt strapped to his waist. "Stay back," she croaked, her voice barely audible through her parched throat. The man raised his hands slowly. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name's Yates Sanderson. I have a ranch near Durango." "Are you the schoolteacher who was on the stage?" Nora blinked in confusion. "How did you?" "The driver made it to Copper Springs, told us what happened." He reached for his canteen and held it out to her. "Here, drink this, slowly now." Her hands trembled as she took the canteen, fighting the urge to gulp the water down. It tasted better than the finest wine she'd ever sampled back in Boston. "Thank you," she whispered after taking a few careful sips. "Can you stand? We need to get you out of here before dark." Nora tried to push herself up but found her legs wouldn't support her weight. She had been walking for so long, then huddled in this spot for what felt like an eternity, afraid to move, afraid to stay still. Without a word, Yates moved forward and gently lifted her into his arms. Nora was too exhausted to protest, her head falling against his shoulder as he carried her back to his horse. "I thought I was going to die here," she admitted as he set her carefully on Midnight's back before mounting behind her. "Not today," he replied, his voice deep and reassuring against her ear as his arms reached around her to take the reins. "I've got you now." As they rode slowly out of the canyon, Nora felt something she hadn't felt since leaving Boston safe. The journey back to Copper Springs took the remainder of the day and well into the evening. Yates kept a steady pace, mindful of Nora's condition. She drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally startling awake when they navigated a particularly rough patch of terrain. "Almost there," Yates assured her each time. His solid presence behind her was like an anchor, keeping her from floating away into the darkness that seemed to hover at the edges of her vision. The small mining settlement of Copper Springs appeared before them as they crested a hill, its scattered buildings illuminated by lamplight. Yates guided Midnight directly to the doctor's house at the edge of town. Dr. William Hayes was a gruff man in his 60s who had seen just about everything the frontier could throw at a person. He took one look at Nora and immediately directed Yates to bring her inside. Dehydration, exhaustion, minor cuts and bruises, the doctor diagnosed after a brief examination. "She's lucky you found her when you did, Sanderson. Another day out there." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Yates waited in the front room while the doctor and his wife tended to Nora. Sheriff Thompson arrived shortly after, looking relieved to see Yates had returned. "Found her in Blackthorn, just like I thought," Yates said before the sheriff could ask. "No sign of the other passengers." Frank sighed and removed his hat. "Henderson and Mills found two of them, an older gentleman and his son. They'd managed to make it to the old mining camp at Rattlesnake Gulch. Benson's still out looking for the last one. The bandits? No sign yet. Probably halfway to Mexico by now with whatever they stole." Mrs. Hayes emerged from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron. "She's asking for you, Mr. Sanderson." Yates found Nora propped up in bed, her face freshly washed and her hair combed back. She looked pale but alive, which was a sight better than how he'd found her. Something in his chest tightened at the sight of her. "Mr. Sanderson," she said, her voice still weak. "I wanted to thank you properly for saving my life." He removed his hat, suddenly aware of the trail dust covering his clothes. "Just doing what anyone would do, Miss Bennett. Nora Bennett." She attempted a smile. "And I think we both know not just anyone would have found me in that canyon." Yates shifted uncomfortably under her direct gaze. Her eyes were a striking blue, like the sky after a summer rain, and despite her ordeal, there was a strength in them that caught him off guard. "Well, Miss Bennett, you should rest now. The doc says you'll need a few days to recover." "What about Durango? I'm already late for the start of the school term." "Don't you worry about that. I'll send word to the school board that you've been delayed. You focus on getting your strength back." He placed his hat back on his head. "I'll check on you tomorrow." As Yates left the doctor's house, he found himself unusually preoccupied with the thought of the schoolteacher's recovery. He had saved people before it came with the territory out here, but something about Nora Bennett's situation had stirred something protective in him that he hadn't felt in a long time. Over the next 3 days, Yates found reasons to visit Copper Springs despite the pressing work waiting for him at the ranch. Each time, he brought something for Nora: a book from his personal collection, fresh biscuits from his cook, wildflowers gathered along the trail. On the 4th day, he arrived to find her sitting on the doctor's front porch, some color returned to her cheeks. "Dr. Hayes says I can travel tomorrow," she informed him as he tied Midnight to the hitching post. "The stage comes through in the afternoon." Yates frowned. "That seems mighty soon." "You were in bad shape just a few days ago." "I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Sanderson," she replied with a touch of pride. "Besides, I've imposed on the doctor and Mrs. Hayes long enough, and I have obligations in Durango." "At least let me escort you," he found himself saying. "I'm headed that way anyhow." The truth was that he had no business in Durango that couldn't wait, but the thought of her traveling alone again so soon after her ordeal didn't sit right with him. Nora studied him for a moment. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to trouble you further." "No trouble at all." He sat down beside her on the porch step. "Truth be told, I'd feel better knowing you arrived safely." She glanced at him sideways. "You're a very unexpected sort of cowboy, Mr. Sanderson." "How do you mean?" "You bring books instead of whiskey, flowers instead of fancy trinkets." She smoothed her borrowed dress, one of Mrs. Hayes's that had been taken in to fit her smaller frame. "And you seem genuinely concerned without expecting anything in return." Yates felt a flush creeping up his neck that had nothing to do with the sun. "Don't think too highly of me, Miss Bennett. I'm just trying to be decent." "Decency is rare enough to be remarkable in my experience," she replied softly. The next day dawned clear and cool, a perfect day for travel. Yates arrived early with a wagon rather than his horse, having decided that the stage would be too jarring for Nora's still recovering body. "What's this?" she asked, coming out of the doctor's house with her small carpet bag, all she had left after the bandits had taken her trunk. "Thought you might appreciate a more comfortable ride to Durango," he explained. "It's about 4 hours by wagon instead of 2 by stage, but the road's smoother." Dr. Hayes nodded approvingly as he helped Nora into the wagon. "A wise choice, Sanderson. Miss Bennett is recovered enough for travel, but a stage ride might set her back." With heartfelt thanks to the doctor and his wife, Nora settled onto the wagon seat beside Yates. He had padded it with extra blankets, and she smiled at the thoughtfulness. As they traveled, Yates pointed out landmarks and told her stories about the area. Nora found herself fascinated not just by the tales but by the man himself. Behind his reserved manner was a quick intelligence and dry humor she hadn't expected. "So what brings a Boston lady to teach in a place like Durango?" he asked as they stopped to rest the horses at a small creek. Nora watched the water flowing over the rocks. "I wanted something different, something real." She glanced at him. "My father was a banker. He died last year, and suddenly I realized I'd been living the life he wanted for me, not the one I wanted for myself." "And what kind of life do you want, Miss Bennett?" "One with purpose, where I can make a difference." She smiled ruefully. "Although I must admit, getting lost in a canyon and nearly dying wasn't part of the plan." Yates chuckled. "Life out here rarely goes according to plan." He offered her a hand to help her back into the wagon, but that's what makes it interesting. They arrived in Durango just as the sun was beginning to set. The town's main street busy with the end-of-day activities. Nora felt a flutter of nervousness as she took in her new home, so different from the Boston she had known, yet not as primitive as she had feared. Yates guided the wagon to a neat 2-story building with a sign identifying it as the widower Caldwell's boarding house. Mrs. Hayes sent a telegram ahead. "This is where the schoolteachers usually stay." A plump, gray-haired woman was already hurrying down the steps to greet them. "You must be Miss Bennett. We've been so worried. When you didn't arrive on the stage as scheduled, and then we heard about the bandit attack, well, thank goodness you're safe." Nora allowed herself to be helped down from the wagon, suddenly aware of how shabby she must look in her borrowed dress with her meager belongings. "Mr. Sanderson found me and brought me safely here," she explained, glancing back at Yates, who was standing awkwardly by the wagon, hat in hand. "Then we owe you our thanks, sir," Mrs. Caldwell said warmly. "Durango has been waiting for its new teacher for quite some time." Yates nodded. "Just glad I could help, madam." There was an awkward moment as Nora realized this was goodbye. This man had saved her life, cared for her recovery, and now would simply ride away. "Mr. Sanderson," she began, not entirely sure what she wanted to say. "I'll check on you in a few days," he said quickly. "Make sure you're settling in all right." Relief flooded through her. "I would appreciate that." As Mrs. Caldwell led her inside, Nora glanced back to see Yates watching her go, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. The first week in Durango passed in a blur of activity for Nora. The school board chairman, a stern-faced man named Horace Jenkins, had been surprisingly understanding about her delayed arrival and eager to install her in the one-room schoolhouse on the edge of town. The children, ranging in age from 6 to 15, regarded their new teacher with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. Nora quickly discovered that her Boston education had prepared her for teaching reading and arithmetic, but not for answering questions about tracking animals or the proper way to break a wild horse. True to his word, Yates appeared at the boarding house on her third evening in town. He had cleaned up considerably, his usually dusty clothes replaced with a pressed shirt and his hair neatly combed beneath his hat. "Mr. Sanderson," Nora greeted him, unable to suppress a smile at the sight of him on Mrs. Caldwell's front porch. "What a pleasant surprise." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Just wanted to make sure you were settling in all right, like I promised." "Would you care to join me for a walk?" she suggested, gesturing to the street where several couples were taking advantage of the pleasant evening air. "I've been inside all day with the children and could use some fresh air." As they strolled through town, Nora told him about her first days of teaching, including some of the more amusing questions the children had asked about life back east. Little Jimmy Porter wanted to know if Boston had Indians too, and seemed disappointed when I told him we didn't have wars with them, she said with a laugh. Yates's expression grew serious. "The children don't know any better, but there's a lot of misunderstanding about the native peoples around here. They've been pushed off their lands, had treaties broken." He trailed off. "Sorry, I don't mean to spoil the evening." "No, please," Nora touched his arm lightly. "I want to understand this place, all of it, not just the pretty parts." He studied her face in the lamplight from a nearby store window. "You're not what I expected, Miss Bennett." "Is that a compliment, Mr. Sanderson?" "Definitely," he replied with a small smile. Their walks became a regular occurrence over the next few weeks. Yates would ride into town every few days, ostensibly on ranch business, and would time his visits to coincide with the end of Nora's school day. Mrs. Caldwell observed these developments with a knowing smile but kept her comments to herself, merely ensuring that freshly baked cookies were available whenever Mr. Sanderson called. The children, less tactful than their elders, were quick to notice their teacher's friendship with the rancher. "Is Mr. Sanderson your beau, Miss Bennett?" 13-year-old Sarah Wilson asked bluntly one afternoon as Nora was dismissing the class. "Mr. Sanderson is a friend who has been kind enough to show me around Durango," Nora replied evenly, ignoring the knowing giggles from the older girls. The truth was, Nora wasn't entirely sure what Yates was to her. Their conversations had grown deeper over time, moving beyond polite small talk to discussions about books, politics, and their hopes for the future. She had learned that he had fought for the Union in the war, returning home to find his parents' small farm abandoned and falling into ruin. Rather than try to rebuild what was lost, he had pushed west to start fresh. "Sometimes you have to leave the past behind to find your future," he had told her during one of their walks. She had been thinking about those words when a knock came at the schoolhouse door late one Friday afternoon. She looked up from grading papers to find Yates standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, glancing at the stack of spelling tests on her desk. "Not at all." She set down her pencil and smiled. "I was just finishing up." "I was wondering if you might be free on Sunday for a picnic," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "There's a spot up in the hills I thought you might like to see. The view of the valley is something special." Nora felt her heart quicken. This was different from their evening walks, more intentional, more like a proper courtship. "That sounds lovely," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "What time shall I be ready?" The relief on his face was almost comical. "I'll come by around noon if that suits you." Sunday dawned bright and clear, a perfect day for a picnic. Nora chose her best dress, a sage green that Mrs. Caldwell assured her brought out the color of her eyes. She pinned her hair up carefully, leaving a few curls to frame her face. Yates arrived precisely at noon with his wagon, looking more nervous than she had ever seen him. In the back was a picnic basket and a bouquet of wildflowers. "These are for you," he said, handing her the flowers. "They're not as fancy as what you might be used to in Boston, but they're perfect," she interrupted, burying her nose in the colorful blooms. "Thank you." The drive to the hills took them through lush meadows dotted with grazing cattle. Yates pointed out landmarks along the way, including the distant outline of his ranch house. "It's not much to look at yet," he admitted, "but I've been saving to add on to it. Maybe a proper front porch, another bedroom or two." "It sounds wonderful," Nora said sincerely. "I'd love to see it someday." He glanced at her quickly, as if gauging her sincerity, then smiled. "I'd like that." The picnic spot was every bit as beautiful as Yates had promised, a grassy clearing atop a hill overlooking the valley below. Durango was visible in the distance, a collection of buildings nestled along the river that cut through the landscape. Yates spread a blanket beneath the shade of a large oak tree and unpacked the basket, revealing an impressive array of food that he sheepishly admitted his ranch cook had prepared. "Mrs. Rodriguez has been with me since I started the ranch," he explained as he handed Nora a plate. "She took one look at me trying to pack this picnic and shooed me out of her kitchen." Nora laughed. "She sounds like a wise woman." They ate and talked, the conversation flowing easily between them. As they finished the apple pie that served as dessert, Nora found herself studying Yates's profile as he gazed out over the valley. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. He turned to look at her, his expression serious. "I'm thinking that I never expected to find someone like you out here, someone who makes me want to be better than I am." Nora's breath caught in her throat. "And how do I do that?" "By seeing the best in everything, even in a rough cowboy who found you half dead in a canyon." He reached out hesitantly and took her hand. "Nora, I know we haven't known each other long, but I find myself thinking about you all the time. When I'm at the ranch, I'm counting the days until I can ride into town to see you." "I count those days too," she admitted, her heart pounding. "I'm not a man of fancy words or grand gestures, but I'd like your permission to court you properly." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "If you think you could consider someone like me." Instead of answering, Nora leaned forward and gently pressed her lips to his. It was brief and sweet, but when she pulled back, the look of wonder on Yates's face made her smile. "I'll take that as a yes," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. The courtship of Nora Bennett and Yates Sanderson became the talk of Durango over the next few months. The schoolteacher and the rancher made an unlikely but charming couple, seen together at church socials, town meetings, and on their regular evening walks. Yates took Nora to see his ranch on a crisp autumn afternoon, proudly showing her the improvements he had made to the original homestead. The main house was simple but solid, with a large kitchen and a comfortable sitting room featuring a stone fireplace and bookshelves filled with volumes that surprised Nora with their variety. "I've always believed a man should feed his mind as well as his body," Yates explained when she commented on his collection. The ranch hands tipped their hats respectfully when Yates introduced Nora, though she caught them exchanging knowing smiles behind his back. It was clear they approved of the woman who had captured their boss's heart. As winter approached, bringing with it the prospect of snowbound days and difficult travel, Yates began to make more frequent trips into town, often staying overnight at the hotel rather than risk the increasingly treacherous journey back to the ranch in darkness. It was during one such evening, as they sat by the fire in Mrs. Caldwell's parlor after the other boarders had retired, that Yates finally spoke the words that had been on his mind for weeks. "I love you, Nora," he said simply, his eyes never leaving her face. "I think I started falling for you the moment I found you in that canyon, and every day since has just made me more certain." Nora's eyes filled with tears of happiness. "I love you too, Yates, more than I ever thought possible." He took her hands in his. "Then would you consider becoming my wife? I know the ranch isn't as civilized as what you're used to, and the winters can be harsh, but I promise I'd do everything in my power to make you happy." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." The kiss they shared sealed their promise, tender and full of hope for the future they would build together. News of their engagement spread quickly through Durango, met with general approval, and only a few disappointed sighs from young women who had harbored their own hopes regarding the handsome rancher. The school board, after some deliberation, agreed that Nora could finish the school term before the wedding, scheduled for the first Saturday in June. The winter passed more quickly than Nora had anticipated, filled with teaching duties and preparations for both the wedding and her eventual move to the ranch. Yates continued his visits whenever the weather permitted, often bringing small gifts, a book of poetry, a length of pretty fabric, once even a kitten he had rescued from a snowdrift. "For when you're at the ranch and I'm out with the cattle," he explained as the tiny gray creature purred in Nora's hands. "So you won't be lonely." Spring brought new challenges as the melting snow turned roads into muddy quagmires and swelled the river to dangerous levels. For nearly 3 weeks, travel between the ranch and town was all but impossible, leaving Nora anxious and Yates frustrated by their separation. When he finally made it through in late April, he was mud-splattered and weary but grinning from ear to ear at the sight of her waiting on Mrs. Caldwell's porch. "I was beginning to think I'd have to swim to town to see you," he said as he swept her into his arms, heedless of the mud transferring to her dress. Mrs. Caldwell tactfully retreated inside, leaving the reunited couple to their privacy. "I missed you so much," Nora confessed, her fingers tracing the lines of his face as if to reassure herself he was really there. "Every day I looked for you. Wild horses couldn't keep me away any longer," he promised, kissing her with all the pent-up longing of their separation. As their wedding day approached, Nora found herself increasingly reflective about the journey that had brought her to this point. Had the stage not been attacked, had she not gotten lost in Blackthorn Canyon, had Yates not been the one to find her, any change in that chain of events might have led her down a completely different path. "You ever think about how easily we might never have met?" she asked Yates as they walked along the river one evening, 2 weeks before their wedding. He considered the question seriously. "I used to not believe in fate or destiny, thought a man made his own way in the world through hard work and determination. But now," he squeezed her hand, "now I think maybe there are some things meant to be, no matter what." The wedding day dawned clear and warm, as if nature itself approved of the union. The small church in Durango was filled to capacity with well-wishers, including Yates's ranch hands in uncomfortable suits and the children from Nora's school, scrubbed clean and on their best behavior. Dr. and Mrs. Hayes had made the journey from Copper Springs to attend, the doctor proudly claiming some credit for bringing the couple together. "If I hadn't patched her up so well, she might never have caught your eye properly," he joked to Yates before the ceremony. Sheriff Thompson served as best man, while Mrs. Caldwell, who had become like a mother to Nora during her time in Durango, took the role of matron of honor. When Nora walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory satin ordered from Denver and altered by the local seamstress, the look on Yates's face was one of absolute wonder, as if he couldn't believe his good fortune. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promising to love and cherish one another through whatever challenges life might bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the congregation nearly raised the roof of the little church. The celebration continued at the town hall, where tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by seemingly every household in Durango. There was dancing and laughter, toasts and tears, until finally, as the sun began to set, the newlyweds departed for the ranch, their home. Yates had spent the weeks leading up to the wedding making improvements to the house, including the addition of a proper front porch with a swing where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset over the valley. "Welcome home, Mrs. Sanderson," he said as he carried her over the threshold, a tradition she had insisted upon despite his protests that she was too precious to risk dropping. "It's perfect," she whispered, taking in the fresh paint, the new curtains hanging at the windows, and the vase of wildflowers on the table, all signs of the care he had taken to make the house welcoming for his bride. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Nora found herself overwhelmed with gratitude for the path that had led her here, even with its dangers and hardships. "I'm so glad you found me," she murmured against Yates's chest. His arms tightened around her. "I'll always find you, Nora, and I'll never let you wander lost again." The first year of marriage brought both joys and challenges for the Sandersons. Nora quickly discovered that being a rancher's wife was very different from being a schoolteacher. There were new skills to master: cooking on a wood-burning stove, managing a household far from town, learning the rhythm of ranch life with its early mornings and long days. Yates was patient with her mistakes, gently showing her how to coax the temperamental stove into behaving or explaining why certain chores needed to be done in a particular way. In turn, Nora brought her own talents to their home, organizing Yates's business records, establishing a small but thriving vegetable garden, and creating a warm, inviting atmosphere that made the ranch house truly feel like home. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch swing, sometimes talking about their day, sometimes simply enjoying the comfortable silence between them as they watched the stars appear in the vast western sky. "I never knew it could be like this," Yates confessed one night as they swayed gently in the swing, Nora tucked against his side. "Having someone to come home to, someone who understands me without words." "I never knew either," she replied, her hand finding his in the darkness. "Back in Boston, I thought I knew what love was supposed to be: proper and restrained, a sensible partnership. I never imagined it could feel like this, so all-encompassing." The changing seasons brought new activities and challenges. Summer meant long days of hard work for Yates, as he and his men moved cattle to higher pastures and repaired fences damaged by winter storms. Fall brought the roundup, when cattle were gathered and some selected for sale, providing the income that would see the ranch through the coming winter. Nora found her place in this cycle, packing lunches for the men, tending to minor injuries, and even learning to ride out with Yates occasionally to check on the herd. Her confidence grew with each passing month, as did the respect of the ranch hands who had initially wondered if the city woman would last through her first western winter. That winter proved to be particularly harsh, with blizzards that isolated the ranch for days at a time. But within their snug home, Nora and Yates found a deepening connection as they shared long evenings by the fire, reading aloud from favorite books, or simply talking about their hopes for the future. It was during one such blizzard, with snow piling against the windows and the wind howling around the eaves, that Nora shared her suspicion that their family would be growing by summer. Yates's reaction was everything she had hoped for: initial shock giving way to a joy so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He gathered her in his arms, his hands gently cradling her still flat stomach as if already protecting their unborn child. "A baby," he whispered in wonder. "Our baby." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring, with Nora blossoming like the wildflowers that carpeted the meadows around the ranch. Dr. Hayes rode out from Copper Springs monthly to check on her condition, declaring her healthy as a horse and twice as stubborn, when she insisted on continuing with her normal activities despite her growing belly. Yates hovered anxiously, trying to find the balance between supporting his wife and smothering her with concern. He hired a young woman from town, Clara Wilson, to help with the heavier household chores, despite Nora's protests that she was pregnant, not invalid. "Humor me," he pleaded when she objected. "It would make me feel better knowing you're not overtaxing yourself when I have to be away from the house." She relented, eventually admitting that having help allowed her to focus on preparing for the baby's arrival, sewing tiny clothes, converting a corner of their bedroom into a nursery area, and reading every book on child-rearing she could get her hands on. As her due date approached in early August, Yates became increasingly reluctant to leave the ranch for any reason, delegating tasks to his foreman that he would normally handle himself. "The baby isn't going to arrive the moment you ride over the hill," Nora teased him one morning as he hesitated before leaving to check on a broken fence line. "I know, but what if today is the day?" he countered, his brow furrowed with worry. "Then Clara will send one of the hands to fetch you immediately," she assured him, rising on tiptoes to kiss him goodbye. "Now go. The fence won't fix itself." It was, perhaps inevitably, later that very day when Nora felt the first pains that signaled the beginning of labor. She was in the garden, harvesting beans for dinner, when a cramping sensation caused her to drop her basket. Clara, who had been hanging laundry nearby, was at her side in an instant. "Is it time, Mrs. Sanderson?" Nora nodded, suddenly speechless as another pain rippled through her. Clara helped her inside and settled her on the bed, before sending one of the younger ranch hands racing to find Yates and another to fetch Dr. Hayes from Copper Springs. Yates arrived in record time, his face pale with worry as he burst into the bedroom. "Nora, are you all right?" She managed a smile despite the intensifying contractions. "I'm fine, just having our baby a bit earlier than expected." He took her hand, his own trembling slightly. "What can I do?" "Just stay with me," she whispered as another contraction began. "I need you here." The labor progressed steadily through the afternoon and into the evening. Dr. Hayes arrived just as the sun was setting, bringing with him his experienced calm and reassuring presence. "Everything's proceeding normally," he assured the anxious father-to-be after examining Nora. First babies often take their time making an appearance. It was well past midnight when Nora's efforts finally brought their child into the world, a robust boy with a shock of dark hair and a lusty cry that proclaimed his arrival to the entire household. "A son, Dr. Hayes announced, placing the swaddled infant in Yates's arms while he attended to Nora. "Healthy and strong." Yates stared down at the tiny face in wonder, tears streaming unashamedly down his cheeks. "He's perfect," he whispered, carefully bringing the baby to Nora's side. "Look what we made together." Exhausted but radiant, Nora reached out to touch her son's velvet cheek. "Hello, little one. We've been waiting for you." They named him William James Sanderson William after Dr. Hayes, who had saved Nora's life after her canyon ordeal, and James after Yates's father. The news of young William's birth spread quickly through the area, bringing a stream of visitors to the ranch over the following days. Mrs. Caldwell arrived with a hand-knitted blanket and enough food to feed the entire ranch for a week. Sheriff Thompson brought a tiny wooden rocking horse he had carved himself. Even the children from Nora's former school sent a book of illustrated nursery rhymes, each page signed with their names. As summer gave way to fall, the new parents settled into a routine centered around their son's needs. Yates proved to be an attentive father, willingly taking his turn walking the floor with William when he was fussy in the night. "You need your rest," he insisted when Nora tried to take the baby from him after a particularly long crying spell. "I can function on less sleep than you." "That's debatable," she replied with a yawn, but allowed him to continue soothing their son. The bond between father and son grew visibly stronger with each passing week. Yates would carry William with him around the ranch in a sling Nora had fashioned, pointing out horses and cattle as if the infant could understand every word. "He's going to know this land like the back of his hand," Yates told Nora proudly. "It will be his someday, after all." As William grew from infant to toddler, his personality emerged curious and determined, with a smile that could charm the sternest ranch hand into playing peekaboo. He had Yates's dark hair and Nora's blue eyes, a combination that strangers often commented on when the family made trips into town. The ranch prospered under Yates's careful management, allowing for further improvements to the house and outbuildings. When William was 2, Yates added a proper second bedroom to the house, moving their son out of the corner of their room into his own space decorated with pictures of horses and cattle. Life fell into a pleasant rhythm, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their growing son. William's first words, "Pa," followed closely by "Ma." His first steps directly toward the cookie jar, and his first ride on a horse, a gentle mare named Daisy with Yates walking alongside, were celebrated as the precious moments they were. It was during the spring of William's 3rd year that Nora began to feel the familiar symptoms of pregnancy once again. The timing was perfect. She thought William was old enough now to understand the concept of a sibling, and the ranch was stable enough that Yates didn't need to work the punishing hours he once had. She shared the news with her husband on a rare afternoon when they had managed to slip away for a picnic by the creek that ran through their property. William was happily engaged in fishing with a stick while his parents spread their blanket in the shade of a cottonwood tree. "I have something to tell you," Nora began, taking Yates's hand in hers, his eyes immediately sharpened with concern. "Is everything all right?" she smiled, still touched by his protective instincts after all these years. "Everything is wonderful. But our family is going to get a little bigger come fall." The joy that spread across his face was as beautiful as it had been the first time. "Another baby, are you sure?" "Quite sure," she confirmed, laughing as he pulled her into a careful embrace. "William," Yates called to their son. "Come here, buddy. Mama has some exciting news." The little boy abandoned his fishing and trotted over, his eyes bright with curiosity. "What is it, Mama?" "You're going to be a big brother," Nora told him, pulling him onto her lap. "There's a baby growing in Mama's tummy just like you once did. And when the baby is born, you'll be able to help us take care of him or her." William considered this information with all the seriousness a 3-year-old could muster. "Will the baby like horses?" he finally asked. Yates laughed and ruffled his son's hair. "I'm sure the baby will love horses, especially if you teach them about it." This seemed to satisfy William, who nodded decisively before asking if he could have a cookie from the picnic basket. The second pregnancy was different from the first, easier in some ways, more challenging in others. Nora knew what to expect now, but chasing after an active toddler while carrying another child proved more tiring than she had anticipated. Yates stepped in wherever he could, taking William with him on his shorter rounds of the ranch to give Nora time to rest. He also hired a permanent housekeeper, Mrs. Morales, an older widow whose children were grown and who was delighted to help care for a lively household. As summer turned to fall, the Sanderson home prepared once again for a new arrival. William, now fascinated with the idea of being a big brother, insisted on helping with every preparation, from setting up the cradle to folding the tiny clothes Nora had saved from his infancy. The baby, however, had timing of her own. Labor began on a stormy October night, with rain lashing the windows and wind howling through the eaves. Dr. Hayes, summoned by a ranch hand who braved the weather, arrived soaked to the skin but ready to assist. This time, the birth progressed more quickly, and just before dawn, Elizabeth Ann Sanderson made her entrance into the world with a cry that seemed impossibly loud for such a tiny being. "She has her mother's spirit," Dr. Hayes commented as he placed the swaddled infant in Nora's arms. "And her father's lungs." Yates, who had been keeping William distracted in the next room during the final stages of labor, brought their son in to meet his sister. The little boy approached the bed cautiously, his eyes wide as he peered at the red-faced bundle in his mother's arms. "She's very small," he observed. "You were this small once too," Yates told him, lifting him up for a better view. "But she'll grow just like you did." William reached out a tentative finger to touch the baby's cheek. "Hello, Elizabeth," he said carefully, pronouncing each syllable as Nora had taught him. "I'm your big brother." The next few years brought both growth and change to the Sanderson family and the ranch. Elizabeth, or Ellie as she was soon nicknamed, proved to be as determined as her brother but with a quieter, more thoughtful demeanor. While William was all action and impulse, Ellie observed carefully before attempting anything new. The ranch expanded its operations, adding more cattle, and even a small horse breeding program focused on developing sturdy, intelligent mounts suited to the demanding work of the range. Yates's reputation as a fair employer and skilled rancher spread throughout the territory, bringing offers of partnership and expansion that he carefully considered, but usually declined. "I don't want to be the biggest rancher in Colorado," he explained to Nora after turning down a particularly lucrative offer. "Just the best at what I do, and I want time to see our children grow up, not be constantly away on business." She loved him all the more for this, for understanding that true wealth wasn't measured in acres or cattle, but in the moments they shared as a family. Those moments were precious indeed. Teaching William to read by the fireside on winter evenings, watching Ellie take her first steps across the kitchen floor, family picnics by the creek in summer, and the Christmas celebrations that grew more elaborate each year as the children's excitement infected the entire household. When William was 7 and Ellie 4, a letter arrived from Boston that brought unexpected news. Nora's uncle, her father's brother whom she had barely known, had passed away and left her a substantial inheritance. "It's enough to send both children to college if they wish to go," Nora told Yates that night as they sat on their porch swing, the letter still in her hands. "Or to expand the ranch, or perhaps do both." Yates was quiet for a moment, considering. "What do you want to do with it, Nora?" "It's your inheritance." "Ours," she corrected gently. "Everything I have is yours as well, you know that." He smiled and took her hand. "All right then, what do we want to do with it?" The answer came more easily than she had expected. "I'd like to set aside portions for the children's futures, of course. But I've been thinking for some time about the lack of a proper library in Durango. The school has a few books, and some families have their own collections, but nothing like what I grew up with in Boston." Yates nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You want to build a library. Not just build it, but stock it with books that would otherwise never make it out here: classics, scientific works, books that could open worlds for children like ours. She squeezed his hand anxiously. "What do you think?" "I think," he said slowly, "that I have never loved you more than I do right now." He kissed her softly. "A library is a perfect legacy, Nora, something that will serve the community for generations to come." The Durango Public Library, funded by the Yates Sanderson Foundation, opened its doors 2 years later in a handsome brick building on the town's main street. Nora served as its first director, riding into town 3 days a week while Mrs. Morales watched over Ellie, who was not yet in school. The library quickly became a center of community life, hosting reading circles, lectures, and special events for children. Yates, initially content to support the project from behind the scenes, found himself drawn into giving occasional talks on ranching and land management that proved surprisingly popular. As the children grew older, family life evolved with their changing interests and needs. William, showing his father's affinity for horses and cattle, began taking on more responsibilities around the ranch. Ellie, quieter but equally determined, developed a passion for books and learning that delighted her mother and amused her father. "She's got your brains, that's for certain," Yates commented one evening after Ellie had peppered him with questions about the stars they were observing through a telescope, a Christmas gift that had quickly become her most prized possession. "And your curiosity," Nora replied, smiling as their daughter carefully recorded her observations in a notebook. "She doesn't just accept what she's told, she wants to understand the why of everything." The years seemed to pass more quickly as the children grew. William's voice deepened, and he shot up in height until he was looking his father in the eye. Ellie blossomed from a serious little girl into a young lady with her mother's grace and her father's steady gaze. Through it all, Nora and Yates's bond remained the center around which their family life revolved. Their love had matured over the years, deepening into something that went beyond the initial attraction and passion of their courtship. They had weathered storms together, both literal ones that threatened the ranch and figurative ones that tested their resilience as a family. There had been difficult years, a drought that nearly crippled the ranch's finances, William's serious illness at age 10 that kept him bedridden for weeks, the death of Dr. Hayes, who had been like family to them since the day he had treated Nora after her canyon ordeal. But there had been far more joyful times, the annual Christmas celebrations that grew more elaborate each year, summer fishing trips to the high country lakes, the 50th anniversary party they had hosted for Mrs. Caldwell and her long-presumed dead husband, who had miraculously returned after years as a prisoner in Mexico. Now, as they approached their 20th wedding anniversary, Nora sometimes marveled at the life they had built together, so different from anything she could have imagined as a young woman leaving Boston for the western frontier. "You ever regret it?" she asked Yates one evening as they sat on their porch swing, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. The children were inside, William helping Ellie with a difficult arithmetic problem for school. "Regret what?" he asked, his arm comfortable around her shoulders. "Rescuing me from the canyon, taking on a city woman who knew nothing about ranch life." He chuckled softly. "That might be the most foolish question you've ever asked me, Mrs. Sanderson." He turned to face her, his eyes still as intense as they had been the day he proposed. "Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. Everything I have that matters, our children, this home, the life we've built, all of it began when I spotted that bit of blue fabric caught on a bush in Blackthorn Canyon." Nora leaned into his embrace, content in the knowledge that the lost young woman from Boston had found far more than safety in the arms of her cowboy. She had found her true home. "I'm glad you found me," she murmured against his shoulder. And I never let you wander again, he reminded her, pressing a kiss to her temple. No, she agreed, smiling as she looked toward the house where their children's laughter could be heard through the open window. You showed me where I belonged instead. 25 years after Yates had found Nora in Blackthorn Canyon, the Sanderson ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous in Colorado. The original modest house had been expanded several times to accommodate their growing family, and now stood as a testament to their hard work. Envision a sprawling, comfortable home that managed to be both impressive and welcoming. William, now 24, had returned from 4 years at college in Denver with new ideas for the ranch's operations. After some good-natured debates between father and son, many of these innovations had been implemented, bringing increased productivity and profitability to the Sanderson holdings. I may be set in my ways, Yates had admitted to Nora after a particularly vigorous discussion with their son about rotating grazing lands, but I'm not too proud to admit when the boy's right. Ellie, at 21, had followed a different path. Her love of learning had taken her east to a women's college in Massachusetts, a journey that had initially filled Nora with anxiety, remembering her own disastrous trip west. But Ellie had inherited her father's self-reliance along with her mother's intelligence, and had thrived in the academic environment, returning home for summers and holidays full of stories about her studies and new friends. It was during one of these holiday gatherings, with both children home for Christmas, that Yates made an announcement over dinner that surprised even Nora. "I've been thinking," he said, setting down his fork and looking around at his family, "that it might be time to show you all something that few people have seen." William raised an eyebrow in a gesture so like his father that Nora had to smile. "What's that, Pa?" the heart of Blackthorn Canyon. Yates's gaze met Nora's across the table. "The place where I found your mother all those years ago." A hush fell over the table. Though the children had grown up hearing the story of how their parents met, it was family legend. After all, neither had ever visited the actual location. The canyon had a fearsome reputation, and Yates had always been adamant about keeping the family away from its treacherous paths. "Really, Pa?" Ellie's eyes were bright with interest. "You've always said it was too dangerous." "It is dangerous," he acknowledged, "if you don't know what you're doing or you're alone. But I've been thinking that it's part of our family's story, and you're both old enough now to see it safely with me leading, of course." Nora found herself unexpectedly emotional at the suggestion. "Are you sure, Yates? You've avoided that place for so long." He reached across the table to take her hand. "I think it's time. It's been on my mind lately how something so good could come from a place of such danger. I want to show our children where our story began." The expedition was planned for the day after Christmas, when the winter weather was clear and crisp, but before the heavier snows of January would make travel difficult. Yates prepared with his usual thoroughness, checking and rechecking supplies, plotting their route carefully, and giving detailed instructions about staying together at all times. As they set out on horseback, Yates and Nora, William and Ellie, Nora felt a strange mixture of anticipation and trepidation. She had never returned to Blackthorn Canyon after her rescue, having no desire to revisit the place where she had nearly died. Yet now, surrounded by her family, she found herself curious to see it through different eyes, the eyes of a woman who had built a life of love and purpose, not the terrified girl she had been. The ride took several hours, with Yates setting a careful pace and pointing out landmarks along the way. As they approached the canyon's entrance, Nora felt her heart quicken at the sight of the towering red stone walls. "It's beautiful," Ellie said softly, gazing up at the formations, "in a forbidding sort of way." That's the danger of it, Yates replied. It lures you in with its beauty, then confuses you with its twists and turns until you're hopelessly lost. They dismounted at the canyon entrance, securing their horses before continuing on foot along a narrow path that wound between massive boulders. Yates led the way, occasionally reaching back to offer Nora a hand over rougher sections, though she needed it less than she might have decades earlier. Years of ranch life had made her sure-footed and resilient. As they ventured deeper into the canyon, the walls rose higher around them, creating a world separate from the open plains they had left behind. Shafts of winter sunlight penetrated at steep angles, illuminating the striations in the rock that told the story of millions of years of geological history. "It's like a natural cathedral," William observed, his voice hushed in the stillness. Nora nodded, understanding the sentiment. Despite the painful memories associated with this place, she couldn't deny its austere grandeur. They continued for another hour, Yates guiding them along paths that sometimes seemed non-existent to the others, but which he followed with unwavering confidence. Finally, they reached a small clearing where a massive boulder sat beside what would be a stream bed in wetter seasons. "This is it," Yates said, his voice suddenly thick with emotion. "This is where I found your mother." The family fell silent, each absorbing the significance of the moment in their own way. Nora moved closer to the boulder, her hand reaching out to touch its rough surface. Memories flooded back the desperate thirst, the certainty that she would die alone, and then the miraculous sound of a human voice calling out to her. "I was huddled right here," she said softly. "I had given up hope when I heard your father calling." Ellie slipped her arm through her mother's. "It must have been terrifying." "It was," Nora admitted, "but in a strange way I'm grateful for it. If I hadn't gotten lost, if your father hadn't been the one to find me." She looked up at Yates, who was watching her with the same tender expression he had worn for 25 years. "I might have had a very different life." William, who had been examining the surroundings with a rancher's eye for terrain, rejoined them. "How did you ever find her, Pa? This place is like a maze." Yates smiled, a hint of his younger self visible in the expression. "Stubbornness, mostly. I just had a feeling she'd be in here, and I wasn't leaving until I found her." "Thank goodness for that stubborn streak," Nora said, reaching for his hand. "It's saved us all more than once over the years." They spread out a picnic blanket in the clearing, sharing a meal in the very place where Nora's life had hung in the balance all those years ago. As they ate, Yates and Nora shared more details of the story than they ever had before: how Nora had fled from the stage robbery, how Yates had tracked her for days, the moment when they first saw each other. "I thought he might be a bandit coming to finish me off," Nora confessed with a laugh. "I tried to look threatening, but I doubt I was very convincing in my state." "You looked like an angel to me," Yates countered, "albeit a very dusty, bedraggled one." As the winter sunlight began to fade, they packed up their supplies and began the journey back. The mood was reflective but peaceful, each of them carrying away something different from the experience. Later that evening, with the children engaged in a game of chess by the fire, Yates found Nora on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the winter chill as she gazed at the star-filled sky. "Are you all right?" he asked, joining her at the railing. "Today wasn't too difficult for you?" She shook her head, smiling up at him. "Not at all. It was actually healing, in a way, to go back there with you, with our children, and to see it not as a place of fear but as part of our story." He nodded, understanding as he always did. "I've been thinking about what William asked, how I found you in that maze. I told him it was stubbornness, but it was more than that." "What was it then?" she asked, curious. Yates was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. I think even then, some part of me knew I was looking for more than just a missing passenger. I was looking for something I didn't even know I needed. He turned to face her fully. When I saw you there, something clicked into place, like finding a piece of myself I hadn't known was missing. Nora felt tears well up in her eyes at the simple poetry of his words. For a man who claims not to have a way with words, you certainly know how to touch my heart, Yates Sanderson. He chuckled softly. 25 years of practice. He pulled her gently into his arms. I meant what I told you that first night, you know, that I'd found you and would never let you wander lost again. You've kept that promise, she whispered against his chest. But you did something even more important. You gave me a home worth staying for, a life worth building. Above them, the western sky was ablaze with stars, the same stars that had witnessed their beginning in a desolate canyon, and now shone down on the life they had created together, a life rich with love, purpose, and the legacy they would leave through their children and the community they had helped to build. In the heart of the Colorado frontier, a lost young woman and the cowboy who had found her had discovered the greatest treasure of all, a love that had only grown stronger with each passing year, a love that had transformed them both and everyone whose lives they touched. And as they stood together on the porch of the home they had built, wrapped in each other's arms beneath the vastness of the western sky, both Nora and Yates knew with absolute certainty that some journeys, no matter how difficult their beginnings, lead exactly where they are meant to go.